welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. This is Rachel Beck, and I decided that I'm going to go ahead and go through the entire novel of To Kill a Mockingbird. Mainly just so you can, hopefully, if you're reading it, you can get some benefit out of it. Also, if you're in AP classes, I have other courses listed in the description below where I go through The Great Gatsby, Their Eyes Are Watching God, and Catcher in the Rye. I already did a couple of videos, so if you want to see an introduction to this, which you probably do, because, one of the things that, the reason anyways why I do the videos the way I do, is so that you can have a way of contextualizing what you're reading and thinking about it as you're reading. Not just for plot, because let's face it, you're not going to write about plot, hopefully. You have to write about an analysis. So the more background knowledge you have, the easier it is to take, a single line and make something of it in your essays. So I want to start with just how Harper Lee sets up this story. In my other video in the introduction, I talked about how this is a coming of age. And coming of age is usually for about a 14-year-old. And it happens in your life too, which is what makes it so interesting. And when you do come of age, it's usually something that happens in your life, some kind of disappointment. It doesn't even really have to be all that tragic. It could be not being invited to a birthday party. That can affect you. You're looking back on it for a very long time as you get older. It's any of those times that you felt rejected in some way, or maybe your parents got divorced or something like that, and you moved to a new school. There's a lot of things that can go on that disrupts the child consciousness of the way the world works. And it's sort of a loss of innocence in a way. So Harper Lee starts the book off with, when he was nearly 13, my brother Jim got his arm badly broken at the elbow. When it healed and Jim's fears of never being able to play football were assuaged, he was seldom self-conscious about his injury. That right there is Jim's coming of age. I mean, this is a very good example for boys, for guys. At some point, your whole life is based on sports, and maybe that dream that, you'll be able to do it someday professionally, or anything like that, and then something happens, and now what? Now how do you find meaning in your life? How do you prove yourself? And in this case, she goes on to say that one arm was actually shorter than the other, and that's why she said, later on after it was assuaged, which is a very good word to use in any essay that you are talking about, in maybe your own coming of age. You could use the word formative. In my formative years, that's The Great Gatsby. Or you have this looking back. Something was hurtful, harmful, but time healed it, okay? And you get a different perspective. So that's the beginning of this coming of age, which is about Scout. But, Jim is a big part of that because she's a kid, he's the older brother, and she plays with him and deals. She really doesn't have anyone else. There's no other little girls in this book. The other thing is that Scout is a tomboy, which, if you think about the context of when this was written, which, was more of the 60s, but it's looking back at the Depression era, girls were supposed to be ladies. They were supposed to wear dresses, not overalls. And they were supposed to learn how to be a proper, basically in training, so that one day you can be a proper wife. And there's nothing wrong with being a proper wife. It's an honorable thing. But it's problematic when it's the only thing, you know? And this isn't what she wants. This isn't, so for girls reading this story at that age, people like Oprah, they liked having scouts. They liked feeling like maybe I'm okay because I think like this girl thinks. Okay, so the other thing that you're going to notice when you're reading this book is that the tone, the voice sort of shifts. You have it in Scout's voice, but you also have an older woman looking back at her life. So the thing to notice in the beginning is, because it sometimes confuses students when they think, well, look at, I mean, what child uses this word? It's Harperly using the words, but you'll see it when you hear her voice, when she has conversations, when she's fighting. It's a very childlike, innocent mentality. Another thing is the Southern characteristics. When she's talking, she's beginning the story, and she's saying, "When did this all really start? When does this story really begin?" And here's another kind of looking back, but you also see that childlike innocence in it. When enough years had gone by to enable us to look back on them, we sometimes discuss the events leading up to the accident. I maintain that the Ewells started it all. But Jim, who was 4 years my senior, said it started long before that. And that starting long before that is kind of the quintessential Southern nostalgic novel. This is where we're going to tell you a story that derives, you know, when people started telling stories, well, even ancient stories, was considered oral literature. You used to sit on the patio and just tell stories. That was entertainment. You know, one of the biggest entertainment that they had was just listening to the radio and listening to President Roosevelt speak to them. And I say, you know, in the introduction, I kind of talk about the Depression. And this is really important because setting it up in this neighborhood, you see that the kids don't really have anything to do. They don't have any money to buy things with. They don't have toys. They had to use their imagination, which is so difficult for children to even imagine. And unfortunately, they don't have to imagine, you know, so much, but they did when they were little. And part of that imaginary world is that mysterious house, which is another kind of Southern Gothic characteristic, that this guy lives here, and we don't know what he does, but we're assuming that maybe he just kills people, you know. And they're scared of this house. And I don't know what childhood group of kids that ride around on their bikes or whatever don't discover that one house that scares them, even if they're making it up in their own mind, which is really what they're doing with the Radley. But again, in my introduction, I kind of speak more to that. So you have the famous description of Macomb. Macomb was an old town, but it was a tired old town when I first knew it. In rainy weather, the streets turned red slop. Grass grew on sidewalks. The courthouse sagged in the square. Somehow it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to Hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of live oaks on the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Ladies bathed before noon, and their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. People moved slowly then. They ambled across the square, shuffled in and out of stores around it, took their time about everything. A day was 24 hours long, but seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with. Nothing to see outside the boundaries of Macomb County. But it was a time of vague optimism. For some of the people, Macomb had just been recently told that they had nothing to fear but fear itself. Okay, so that vague optimism in the background is Roosevelt speaking to them gently from the radio as if he was sitting in the house with them. And in my introduction, what I explained about Roosevelt and why I think he's important is because Roosevelt goes through his own tragedy of polio. I mean, he goes from living a charmed life, a very physical, robust kind of guy, to not being able to walk, use his legs. And this is right before he wants to run for president, mind you. So, excuse me, he's going through probably the worst suffering a person could go through. And so is the country. And it's because of that suffering, I think, that something in him begins to rise to the occasion. It makes him stronger in many ways. And so I kind of go over that too in the introduction. There's a reflection of what you're going through is like the microcosm. So, you know, his impoverished body was the microcosm of the impoverished nation. Wouldn't that be something that you could write about in an essay that would sound, you know, pretty good? That's what I'm here for. Okay, so this scene, one thing I also want to point out, because I want to later on make a video about Go Set a Watchman, is it really upsets me that people are letting that kind of dictate how they feel about To Kill a Mockingbird when it was never intended as a separate book. One of the reasons why it's obvious it wasn't is because it's not as well written. This is a work of revision, of 10 years of revision. The other one reads like a rough draft. The other one says, my father had integrity. She never says Atticus has integrity. She doesn't have to. She shows you. That's a big difference between, you know, when you're writing and you're telling someone, or you're actually showing someone. Now you're getting a little, you know, you got to give people an image, and that takes a lot of revision. If you reread this, and you may do it as a close read in class or something, you feel that this is a very hot and oppressive kind of neighborhood in a way. There's nothing going on. And if you're from a small town like I am, you can see when I go from Houston to where I'm from in Tyler, people do move slowly. I notice that at the grocery store and everything's like, I have to get out of my, you know, kind of city mode to go back and just be patient. But that's the way it was. Okay, so some other things about Scout is one thing that's significant. There's only a line devoted to it, but that her mother dies. And why this is important, anytime when you're reading a child narrator, and most of the time if the book involves a child, you will see this, because it's the orphan archetype. Now normally, like for the heroic cycle, the child is an orphan, and she has Atticus. But Atticus is also a man of his time, you know, and fathers back then, they didn't play with their children like they do today. But the other important thing is that she does have a mother figure, and it's Calpurnia. And I just want to read you something she says about Calpurnia, because you hear the childlike person who doesn't like to be disciplined. You usually don't like the person who has to tell you, it seems like all they ever do is tell you what to do. And that's what she is. She does love her, but we have to consider this is her child view of Calpurnia. She was always ordering me out of the kitchen, asking me why I couldn't behave like Jim when she knew he was older, and calling me home when I wasn't ready to come in. Our battles were epic and one-sided. Calpurnia always won, mainly because Atticus always took her side. She had been with us ever since Jim was born, and I have felt her tyrannical presence as long as I could remember. So you have that mix of the voice. You have Harper Lee looking back, and you have Scout. So once you start to distinguish that, it'll be easier to sort of listen for, you know, the voices. That's why you should also read in silence. You don't have a whole lot of opportunities in your day to just turn off the noise. let the voice go on in your head. You will become a better reader if you do that. And sometimes read it out loud just for practice, because you want to develop this kind of vocabulary yourself. And you will. You will find yourself describing to your father or something over dinner this tyrannical presence. And it'll make you sound brilliant. Okay, so there you go. All right, so we also have Dill in the story. And Dill is another orphan archetype, but he's more of the neglected, abandoned child. He does have a mother. He doesn't know where his father is. It's a point of embarrassment for him to not be able to say my dad died, but basically that he's just, I don't know. That's really bad, because in the South during this time too, what was really important was your name and who your father was. And so he kind of has this lack of identity. And so what he does, which is what happens, people usually turn into narcissists who have been abandoned. And the truth is, Dill is Truman Capote. And if you know anything about Truman Capote, you see that he is a narcissist. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But he has to invent his own life, really. He doesn't have a family. You know, he doesn't have a situation in life that is stable. When Truman Capote later on wrote In Cold Blood, Harper Lee went with him to help investigate and do the research. Okay, years later, she writes To Kill a Mockingbird. Actually, it was already probably written, but it hadn't quite been published. There's a scene in the movie about Truman Capote, where they're mostly men, you know, writing for the New York Times or whatever. And they ask in a very belittling way, what are you working on, to Harper Lee? A children's book? And she just says, yes, a children's book. Now, she's the only one of that group who got a Pulitzer Prize for her novel. But you can see how she was not taken seriously. And in the Hey Boo documentary, which I highly recommend, I forget who it was, but someone mentioned, oh, it's her sister, mentions that Truman was jealous of her. And they showed this video clip where someone was saying, you know, did you help her write this book? Now, if you've read Truman, you know there's no way. This writing is completely different. It's a very different style. And he says, well, I have my secrets. And it's just total BS, because it's just so not true. And that was one of her closest friends and oldest friends. They didn't stay friends. But for the story purposes, he's really the only one who is a real character that she claims. But you can see that she's really writing from a part of her actual life. Okay, so the other part that's important in the story is Boo Radley. But again, it's in the introduction where I talk about that. So you can just look at that. Next time, I'll go over probably chapters 2 and 3. And I'll just keep going through some key components in each chapter and sort of analyzing it in terms of ways that you could talk about it in an essay. Okay? Thanks for listening.